few historical facts I want CRT promoters to know. Slavery was everywhere on earth in ancient times. In the first place, the ban was England, but the ban was not completely put into practice until the 15th century. The merchants didn't enslave the African tribesmen. They brought slaves to the Americas. The tribesmen were slaves owned by their own local lords who either sold them to the interested slave traders or lost them in minor battles. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 1500s, following the Age of Discovery, first launched by Portuguese colonizers and was exercised for 300 years. During the entire time, there was no such country called the United States of America. It was basically colonies of the empire called the Great Britain. Slave trades everywhere in the world were first introduced under imperialism. The empires kept slave trades legal, so there would always be people doing these deals. And guess what? The country that first banned slave trade was the United States of America. The American people pushed the ban, and only slavery had been practiced in the U.S. territories. It would be impossible to entirely emancipate slaves back then. The white people fought and died to free the slaves. You may say the war wasn't only about slavery, but it was abolished as a result. And most people participating in the war were white. Maybe not all of them were there to fight for the slaves' freedoms, but they couldn't have been against their beliefs. The conclusion is slavery was basically abolished by white people, not defeated by the black slaves. So if you try to explain that technically the federal troops were fighting for their own, they didn't really mean to save the black slaves, then you're full of shit. America has always been ahead of time in human rights. If you want to go over the legal systems in Europe, sure they probably did better on some things, but remember those legal systems were subject to their own territories. They were imposed on their own people. The rules in the African colonies were totally played differently. Up until the decolonization of Africa taking place in the 15th and 60s, they were always technically slaves. Talking about black people historically being attacked by white people, black politicians being assassinated by the government, why don't you talk about the hundreds of thousands of white Southerners killed by the Northerners? Was that institutional hatred directed by evil white Northerners towards white Southerners too? My response to this Jay Marsden, I didn't finish watching the video, but I stopped halfway because there were already a lot of flaws in this man's argument. I respect him for speaking out his true feelings without all yelling meaningless slogans and shit. That did earn some of my respect to him as a human being. I'll start with his theory about police originally from slave catching culture. There's something you need to know about the police as well as all the public systems that we have today, which are derived from ancient systems that are not as civilized and righteous from today's views. But it's a very false myth that patrollers were original policemen. Slave patrol was only a branch of law enforcement back at the time. Of course, when slavery was abolished, these slave catchers were then transferred into doing other similar jobs, and they became part of the police system too. But binding two things together is really dumb. It's just like saying the modern armies came from ancient guardians and warriors that were there to serve only royals and nobles, not the ordinary people. But modern soldiers are being paid to protect the country. That means the safety of all the people living in the country. Now let's move on to drugs. Whatever your views on marijuana are, this is not the way you depict history, blaming everything on racism, because your argument can be easily defeated using another historical fact that took place similarly. If you know there used to be an alcoholic ban too, you could explain this as discriminatory acts against Germans, because German Americans had most breweries back then, and nobody sees that because we are not some social justice warriors who try to make everything about racism. Mass incarcerations, let's talk about that too. It's true that blacks are highly incarcerated people, but to argue that something exists, we need to prove the links and correlations between the causes and effects, not just pointing out one thing and say, see, this is racist. We can use incarceration race to possibly find out if racism exists when the incarceration rates are disproportionate to the crime rates. Vagrants tactics, oh sure. This act would sound crazy to us living in modern day, but do you know, you can treat history with today's standards. There were always transitory laws during any law reforms. It's only obvious to me over the past 200 years since the United States was founded, the country has only changed for the better. That's what I know. Such acts, as well as the Jim Crow laws, were only transitory laws to appease people who were worried about the free slaves that would cause turmoil to law and order when they weren't in plantations anymore. So it was pretty much agreed upon by both abolitionists and pro-slavery people. There would be laws. His question was, does the current U.S. government hate black people? And you go on with a lot of historical events that are no longer relevant to explain what that's the way it is. I see you're trying to way too hard to justify the criminals, writers. I hate to say, but what happened to Tulsa, Oklahoma 100 years ago, if it happened to these writers today, it would have served these rowdy motherfuckers just right. You see, liberals are just trying way too hard to stretch things to unlimited boundaries. He just whine about black people being in a ghetto committing crimes because they never got repaired. And his comparison of individuals to the crime, to the entire race, was even more laughable. I mean, there were Irish, Jews, Japanese, Chinese people who were enslaved, who were severely discriminated against. They're much more prosperous today, not because the U.S. government repaired them, but they built strong communities, became more economically influential by themselves, and so important the country had to take them seriously. The Jews didn't take over the Wall Street because the government repaired them. The Asians didn't take over the Silicon Valley because the government reissued them. They straightened up all by themselves through hard work and discipline. The affirmative action gives people much easier access to education, and look what comes out of it. The Asian Americans never got the privilege to make starting off easier, but they ended up being more successful than most whites, and they're still having this discriminatory college enrollment system created by the Democrats to keep them out of equal access to higher education. And you're here complaining about no representation, no shit. The reparations have always been made to the people of color via a lot of welfare packages that are exclusive to blacks. And I don't see what more reparations should people be seeking right now. Talking about black people, historical being Uh, forget about it. Peace.